important. We also believe that education plays a huge role in being able to make sure that peace is understood and understood in the ways it needs to be, especially today when the world around us is hostile and is very violent. So today we stand here also at the inception of one of the first conferences that the Mahatma Gandhi Center is hosting, but also at a juncture where we have started a student movement called the Students for Peace, which is going to go hopefully and potentially global, wherein students understand from a very young age the ludicrous nature of violence and the importance of nonviolence in peaceful methods of transformation. And with that, I would like to call upon stage and talk to us through the welcome address, a person who has been such an inspiration, who has established a huge university in such a small span of time, from the brainchild that it was in 2009 to its present glory. It's a big thing, right? So I invite upon stage the founding Vice Chancellor, Mr. C. Rajkumar, to address us all. Thank you.
For that introductory remarks. First of all, I want to apologize for the slight delay in starting this program. We always have the challenge to bring Sonipat to Delhi, and one of the reasons I always prefer to have our events in Sonipat is not only because of this sort of movement of people from Sonipat to Delhi, but also a larger intellectual discourse with the entire university community being available. But we are very grateful to our partners, the India International Center, and of course the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies for initiating this conference here at IIC. I was very pleased when Ramin mentioned to me about the theme of this conference and the fact that we are doing a conference with a focal attention on revenge to forgiveness. It is needless to say that the issue of forgiveness in all its manifestations is so critical, not only because of the issues surrounding both the philosophical as well as the sociological ideas surrounding forgiveness, but also its contemporary application in the global discourse, where increasingly we have evidence to suggest that both countries and societies and governments are far more willing to adopt violent measures to deal with conflicts internationally, but also even dealing with domestic issues such as crimes. So the need for developing better understanding, both at the philosophical level, but also at the more practical level, as to how do we evolve an institutional framework, a legal framework, but also a philosophical framework that gets applied in the context of governance as to how we develop a society that is much more embracing notions of forgiveness. I think it's also important to recognize the fact that the history of recent history of the world has seen some extraordinary examples. The Mahatma Gandhi Center, the man who spent good part of his life advocating the notions of peace and nonviolence, is obviously a great inspiration. But I would like to briefly reflect about the work of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and the entire context of South African reconciliation process. In fact, it is probably far more difficult for somebody like Nelson Mandela, who had spent over 30 years at the Robben Island prison, to develop a sense of forgiveness and elevate that sense of forgiveness to public policy and governance. That's an extraordinary sort of inspiring framework on the basis of which we can begin to understand it's not that issues surrounding forgiveness remains in the realm of philosophy, but it can actually be integrated into practical solutions for governance. In fact, if probably while South Africa is going through a number of other crises like every other society today, the foundations of contemporary democracy and values that prevail in South Africa, it can be clearly traced back to the founding vision of people like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, who understood the need for integrating forgiveness and transcending more myopic visions of revenge and retribution, even punishment, through a process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Although such attempts in various forms and manifestations were tried in East Timor, and many other examples are there in the world, but the South African example is a very shining example of how the Truth and Reconciliation process, whose focus is to seek forgiveness of some kind and appreciation and acknowledgement of guilt, not in the sense of what the legal system could provide, a deeper sense of atonement in relation to what mistakes, faults, and violations that have occurred in the course of that journey. It's also useful to mention that today's society is become more violent, not only because of the fact that violent responses meets with state violence as well. One of the important aspects of that state-sponsored violence to crime is an example of death penalty, and so long as we in India, but also in many other countries, death penalty remains in the statute, there is an obvious recognition of a state's response having its basis on violence will continue. The question really is, how do we elevate the sense of forgiveness within societies that goes deep into the framework of people who have themselves been victims of violence? I would draw your attention to a very short, wonderful article written by Desmond Tutu in The Guardian some time ago. In fact, it was 10 years ago, and the title of the article is called The Doctrine of Revenge. And in that article, this is an issue which always comes about whenever we talk about forgiveness. He talked about the idea of how the victims will have to come to terms with the reality of their own victimization, and how they acknowledge and appreciate the need for forgiveness. And typically the question that's asked, and I'm going to quote, and he says, I quote, "It is often asked by those favoring the death penalty, quote, what if your child was murdered? And it is an unquote, and it is a natural question. Rage is a common reaction to the homicide of a loved one, and a wish for revenge is understandable. But what if the person condemned to death was your son? No one raises a child to be a murderer, yet many parents suffer from the grief of knowing their child is to be killed. In 1988, the parents of those on death row in South Africa wrote to the president saying, to be a mother or father and watch your child going through this living hell is a torment more painful than anyone can imagine. We must not put these children to death. It is to inflict horrific and unacceptable suffering upon them and their mothers and fathers," unquote. In a way, there's been a lot of academic work in this area. It's not a new area of research, although for it to be brought to a greater degree of public and intellectual consciousness among civil society is an important task. We need to move beyond the human rights prism through which issues relating to death penalty and conflict resolution has been seen. We need to, and that's why this conference and Ramin's own work on raising the philosophical foundations of forgiveness needs to be underscored. There's another interesting work by Suzanne Friedman, who was a professor of educational psychology and foundations. There's a statement issued by her at the Nelson Mandela's tribute as a part of the Center for Multicultural Education. And the statement is here with me, but I will just read a portion of the statement which talks about, and I quote, "Forgiveness can be defined, quote, a willingness to abandon one's right to resentment, negative judgment, and negative behavior towards one who unjustly injured us, while fostering the undeserved qualities of compassion, generosity, and sometimes even love toward him or her." This is part of the Enlightened Human Development Study Group in 1991. Suzanne talks about why this definition is quite interesting. And she says, notice in this definition that one has a right to feel resentment and that the offender does not deserve our compassion and generosity based on his or her actions. Mandela definitely has a right to feel resentment and hatred too for those who tortured him. His offenders did not deserve his compassion and goodwill, but he gave it anyway. He viewed his offenders with compassion and as human beings who deserve to be treated with respect because of their humanity. There's a quote which Mandela himself had written in a letter to General Jeffries, Commissioner of Prisons, written on Robben Island, Cape Town, July 12, 1976. And I quote, "I have never regarded any man as my superior, either in my life outside or inside prison," unquote. And at the inaugural address of Mandela on 9th May 1994, he said, and I quote, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another." Of course, in a way, Mandela further articulated that vision all through the early stages of nation-building effort there, and he told, while addressing to the ANC as well as his people, he talked about, and I quote, "Please do not be defined by the prejudices of your enemies. You don't want to live burnt by fear and the hatred like they do. The real freedom is to escape from the cycle of violence and war and all the games of power that will destroy you." And Tutu mentioned in relation to forgiveness, and I quote, "To forgive is indeed the best form of self-interest, since anger, resentment, and revenge are corrosive of that summum bonum, the greatest good," unquote. In a way, I want to bring this to your light to bring home the larger point about the fact that we need to elevate the discourse surrounding revenge and forgiveness as a part of its larger impact on public policy and governance. And once we bring that to that effort, we probably have to redesign our own imagination towards addressing not only the big issues of terrorism and national security and conflict resolution, but also the day-to-day issues of crime and violence that our societies are. In some ways, we need to integrate issues surrounding forgiveness, reconciliation, and atonement as a part of our day-to-day effort to build a society that is going to respect humanity. I would like to end by saying that we are very delighted that this conference is being hosted here at the India International Center. We're grateful to its director for partnering with us. I thank my colleague, Professor Amin, as well as the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies, the fellows and other colleagues here present here, and also our distinguished alumni, Shama. Shama was praising the university, but obviously she has an important conflict of interest. She has been a graduate of our university, and we are very, very delighted that one of our graduates is now our faculty member, and I appreciate her contribution towards the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, for those words. Now, without further ado, I call upon the Executive Director of the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Center, Mr. Ramin Jahan Beglu. He is a wonderful, wonderful person and such a delight to work with, and he really needs no introduction, and I would not waste any further time, so Professor Jahan Beglu.
Esteemed Vice Chancellor, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very delighted to welcome you to this conference on revenge and forgiveness, which is organized by the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Peace Studies at Jindal Global University. And I wish to express my gratitude and appreciation to Professor Raj Kumar, the Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University, for his presence here today and for his insightful and encouraging words. I also want to thank the director of the IIC and also the program officer, Mrs. Premola Ghosh, for their help in organizing this conference today. As you know, our center has been active in promoting globally the values of peace and nonviolence, and indeed we have worked with many of you here present And we will work actually in the future also with many of you present here. We have already invited people like Com Carpentier. We will work with the Afghan students who are here and in our workshop in April. So the work will continue in the future. As for today's meeting, it could not be more timely, I think. I think the call for a conference on revenge and forgiveness is more than urgent in a world torn apart by fanaticism, religious hatred, racism, misunderstandings, stereotyping, and violent conflicts. I myself, I come from a region of the world, Iran, where the notion of revenge is overpowering. I mean, one drop is enough to start a tribal feud or a sectarian war in the Middle East. And as a result, the idea of revenge, and in contradistinction, I would say, to it, the ideal of forgiveness, have indeed preoccupied me since I was a teenager. Maybe I was born under a sky which seemed to be overfilled with violence, or is it because when we suffer from injustice and we cannot think about anything else, we think about revenge? I soon realized that revengefulness was not an accidental disaster or a horrific interlude in our history, but it remained a reality of human existence itself, the terror of which had no beginning and no ending. True in both revenge and forgiveness, the individual is aware of the full and irreducible otherness of the other, but it is only through forgiveness, I think, that we can live with the world and not only in it. With the world and not only in it. After all, I think that we are all dialogical beings, even if we kill and destroy each other. Therefore, forgiveness reveals the relation between persons that make dialogue possible. It is the condition for dialogue and is most realized in dialogue. Above all, it presents the shared values, especially moral, as the minimum or minimum background that shapes forgiving persons such as to make the dialogue possible in the first place. Yet, even if forgiveness avoids revenge, it has problems of its own in bringing humanity together, and we see it everywhere. Simply put, revenge is like scratching a cat because the cat scratched you. It is an eye for an eye morality which escalates violence rather than restoring justice and fairness. Revenge is a negative form of reciprocity marked by the rejection and the destruction of the other. As for forgiveness, which is opposed to revenge, is a noble sentiment of mutuality accompanied by a sense of empathy and compassion. It is characterized by a series of mutuality accompanied by a series of changes that occur within an individual or a nation which is wronged by another person or another nation. And it's interesting that today we have Afghans present in our conference because they are people who have been wronging themselves or being wronged by others, and they're trying to get out of it. So forgiveness is often an individual choice or a political act of abandoning vengeance and resentment and replacing it with a reconciliation and tolerance. We are said to live in a time of global village and multiculturalism, but give very little thought to the actual nature of cultures and traditions. Priding ourselves on being civilized, we function day to day as laborers in a world market, but with no true knowledge of the past civilizations in whose name we create colleges, clubs, and political parties. But none of us, especially those who care about nobility of spirit and creative genius that is so essential for the survival of what we are as human beings with a social, historical past, can ignore the multiple crises in human affairs and the dangers of the moment. So let us ask, what is lacking and how can we correct it? Well, without pretending to have a prophetic recipe or a magical formula, and by referring only to my own life experience as a person who has lived in 7 different countries and traveled to 39 different countries, or even that of others as revealed in literature, philosophy, religion, politics, art, I have suggested the noble goal of forgiveness as opposed to hatred, vengeance, and resentment. And I'm convinced that if we seek forgiveness, whatever form it takes, we must labor to find it rather than working for an insignificant world based on values such as greed, power, and hatred. And this is a responsibility that our human civilization should accept without fear or apprehension. I do not know if it is possible to divert the future of our world in another direction. I don't really know. But I know that the two difficult things in life are accepting the errors of the past, as we see in South Africa, in Afghanistan, and many other places, Chile, Argentina, and preparing for the truths of the future. Every one of us has a different understanding of the past, but we all like to look at our future as offering good changes and progress in the right direction. Yes, I have no shadow of doubt that if our contemporary world is to attain maturity and common sense, which it doesn't have, as we see with the election of Mr. Trump in America, moving beyond its present violent lunacy and constructive madness, it must be attuned to the aim of forgiveness and reconciliation as the condition sine qua non of living together. My general conviction is that there can be no human civilization without compassion. And the ethos of shared responsibility finds its expression in the process of taming violence through the act of forgiveness. And this is where we should look for a political exercise of moderation and empathy, where a climate of cooperation and reconciliation could flourish. Today, in a world riddled by insignificance and violence, and I would underline insignificance because insignificance is, again, what brings people like Mr. Erdogan and Trump and Duterte and others to power in this world, it's no longer, indifference is no longer permitted. To fail to recognize this is to betray our conscience. Indifference has cheapened our human life. Therefore, forgiveness is a quality that cannot be manufactured by businessmen and politicians. It is the quality of a person pursuing decency and human dignity beyond all forms of arrogance and hostility. Its ongoing relevance makes forgiveness all the more compelling in current debates on violence, on democracy, and mainly on culture, I would say. And the Vice Chancellor was quoting Tutu, actually, and this is what Tutu said. I have also a quote from Tutu. He says, "It is ultimately in our own best interest that we become forgiving, repentant, reconciling, and reconciled people, because without forgiveness, without reconciliation, we have no future." At least that was the case for South Africa. While some will follow Tutu, others will think that what he suggests is madness. But, as the Greek writer Nikos Kazantzakis says in his book Zorba the Greek, a man needs a little madness or else he will never dare cut the rope and be free. And if there is only one beautiful madness in the world which can free us from all forms of political and religious lunacy, it's the act of forgiving the person while not forgetting the event. As such, forgiveness as a new beginning is not when the past is forgotten or hidden in a corner of our mind. It is when our past sufferings are not repeated and we do not repeat each other's. This is when we enter the stage of history, not from the backstage door, but by being fully present in the agora. Agora is actually a forum that we constructed at Jindal in order to predict horror and warn others about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jahan Beglu. This was a wonderful eye-opener for some of us, and for some of us a reaffirmation maybe of what we already know and feel in our hearts, but haven't quite been able to articulate in that profound and wonderful manner. With no further delay, as we are already 15 minutes late, I would like to start the next panel. It is going to be Professor Shiv Vishwanathan, a wonderful, wonderful stalwart in our day. It is just a pleasure to hear him talk. And then we have Mr. Omar Sadar from the South Asian University. And we have on this panel also Mr. Krishnappa, who is a doctoral fellow at Jindal Global University. And the man who needs no introduction, Mr. Ashish Nandi, would be chairing this panel. We have taken panel 2 before panel 1 because of certain guests who would like to leave a little early. And I, without further delay, call upon them. And I really hope that at least within this room, we can make our journey from a certain amount of apathy to empathy. And this, I look at the students when I say this, because I know that for the rest of us, we are trying already. But for the students, I know that this will be a very educational experience if they let it be. So please pay attention and try our best to retain what we say here. All right, let's start. Thank you.